David Green and I developed the first edition as the fourth in a series of texts on teaching English literature, That was the first edition, and some of you might be familiar with some of our earlier work, Literacies and Learners, 3 editions of that. And thanks very much to many lecturers and students who purchased and used our books. We chose Tompkins because we could see how it provided lecturers and their students, as well as classroom teachers, with a balance of content, theory and teaching strategies, and also ways in which teachers could become involved in professional self-development. And Carol then joined us to edit the online videos that we developed for the first edition, and she joined us in the development of the second edition that we're talking about today. And in this second edition, we've completed the number of Australian teachers, and the Australian curriculum English is now referenced and linked throughout the book. Carol.
Well, thanks, Rod, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm one of those lecturers about whom Rod has just spoken. In 2008, I was appointed to a position of lecturer at USC and given the task of preparing 4 courses in English instruction for pre-service teachers, whose area of expertise was going to range from early years right through until secondary. Now, as you'd understand, one of my first tasks was to provide text for these students that would support the learning. And for that, I had certain criteria. I've always looked for texts that have a balance in design. By that I mean I was looking for a text that had some theoretical background. There was time and space given to the development of pedagogy and assessment for and of learning. I wanted something that was connected to the Australian curriculum, and so it had currency, and of course that enduring value of a text is something that we all value, and ease of use was another consideration for me. I suppose I was looking for a go-to text for our students. This is way back in 2008, which would provide them with that understanding of how important it is, as Freebody tells us, it's the biggest job in town, to teach students how to teach explicitly in reading, writing and oral language. So after many months of exploration, a lot of reading from a lot of publishers, I found the Literacy for the 21st Century, which at that time was Tompkins' text, and that was where my commitment began. I was really, really excited when I was invited by Rod and David to join them in as a video editor for that first Australian edition of the text. And I guess I felt very humbled, I have to quickly say, to be working with these guys, and but also really excited because they were very open to looking at everybody's contribution to the text. Another highlight of my first involvement was that I was working in the field. I was actually working here at Mountain Creek, at Buderim. We worked at Kenmore with local teachers and children whose photographs you see throughout the text and whose work is showcased in the MyEducationLab. So apart from the local content, that first Australian version of the text offered what I considered essential learning for my students. It engaged them in a balanced overview on instruction. But I hasten to add that that balanced overview was all about explicit instruction. So they learned the what. What did they have to teach according to language literacy and literature at text, word and sentence level as recommended by the Australian curriculum? Why did they need to do it? Well, the theory is there to support that. And how to teach. So the teaching strategies are also deeply embedded in the text and, in my view, one of the key components of that text that makes it so different. So for me, as a beginning lecturer at this university, it offered a design, a framework that helped me design the courses that I was using. And, over time has really earned the students' favour. One student said to me recently, this is one book I'll never part with. The addition of the Australian video clips, I think, has really, really provided a very different perspective on teaching and education. It provides additional insight into classroom pedagogy and instruction in reading, writing and oral language. And the video clips, the tutorials, the examination systems are additional additional resources that people like myself can use time and time again in lectures and tutorials, and students can go back to and use as they require. I add that the chapter references are also something that my students reference in order to get additional information. So supporting my views of the text's value are comments I received from students and staff recently because I've been conducting a number of interviews for particular research that I'm undertaking. One of the questions was, would you speak about your view of the text chosen in this course? Now, I've had 31 respondents so far, and the range of responses is quite great. It's all very, very positive. But just yesterday, one of my students said, it's an awesome text, just awesome. I love there was a section just for strategies, because when you're in the classroom, you can just go to that area and you do not have to go through the whole book to find them. I hasten to add, it does help if you go through the book to find them. Another student who's studying in secondary education said to me it was only in weeks 9 and 10 that I picked up on the high school side of those strategies. A lot of them, like word walls, etc., didn't make sense until the later weeks when I could figure out what to do and how to make the learning achieve a higher level. So that's my insight into the text and why it is that I use it at this time.
Okay, thanks, Carol.
Back to you, right?
Okay, thanks, Carol. Basically, the title there are two parts to the title: 21st century and balanced. And the 21st century is met in a number of ways, including a clear commitment to multiliteracies, and which is what David and I have been involved with since we first started out with the concept of literacies and learning. A balanced approach we've talked about sufficiently. What I'd like to point out with the book itself is that the book itself is well designed. The colour and design is put there to help you as a teacher or a student to access the content, information and the teaching strategies, as well as the summaries. So the design and use of colours of figures also highlights a whole range of things. So I'll show you some of those without going into detailed print, because we don't have time for that. But that little summary of part 1, you'll find it in the 3 parts plus the compendium. You've got a summary of what are the basic principles upon which the book has worked. So in the remaining 6 or 7 minutes that I have, there's you'll find one of these figures, the components of a balanced literacy approach, with the components listed on the side and the descriptions of each of these, which means that students and teachers have a clear shared understanding of what it is that they're teaching, and it's that shared knowledge that is particularly important in teaching English, in teaching mathematics even more so. But that shared understanding, shared knowledge, shared language for teaching it, and that's basically where I've been working with now for almost the last 30 years. There's another one here on sharing young children's literacy development through the normal stages of emergence, through beginning to fluent, and in the chapters in the book on development of reading and writing, you will see all the text sitting around, photographs as well as these stages. Instructional recommendations for the 3 stages of reading and writing. It's these summaries which become particularly important as access points and quick access points to it. Literacy is assessed in many ways in the book, and although Chapter 3 is the major chapter, assessment of spoken language, reading, writing and spelling is featured in other chapters in order to facilitate the appropriate implementation of the teaching-testing relationship. That is, assessment is used for improving teaching and learning. And when you get into chapters 3 and 5, you'll find my recommendations for a program called FAST, Formative Assessment of Student Use of Tasks, which will get the students to write more, take more responsibility for their writing and cut back on your marking load. because there is no evidence to suggest that that correcting every mistake done by every student on every piece of paper and handing it back is going to lead to improvement in writing. I've done the research and I wasn't allowed to publish it because I use teachers training. I use teachers college students for it. But you can see where some of this assessment is here in chapter 5, where Keone has written something and I've analysed it there. So you get a bit of an idea of the ways in which teachers and in helping your students, the ways in which things are done. And that's a magnificent chapter on cracking the alphabet code, which was one of the standout chapters of Gail Tompkins' first edition in 1997. Looks at the development of phonemic awareness through phonics, through spelling in great detail, with lots of information, and links perfectly almost into the Words Their Way spelling program and underpins and supports many other spelling programs. What we're moving into now is chapter 6. Chapter 6 is on teaching basically how English works. Grammar, if you like, which is not exactly the right term to use, but knowledge of English language. And there is a companion book that Graham Riles and I put out earlier this year called Teaching English Grammar, and that book provides the program for teaching language at every grade level from P to 10 with backup support for teachers. In effect, that book fills out the tacit or implicit knowledge in the Australian Curriculum English version 5. And by the way, both books are up to date with version 5. Whereas version 6 and 7 haven't made any difference. Okay, so principles for teaching grammar. Essentially, they are the same for teaching any concept in any area. Authentic texts, interactive teaching strategies, the kinds of things that you're already familiar with. And since this will be up later, I'll let you work through it. A couple of things I do want to tell you about first. There are 8 parts of speech, and they can be divided into 2 areas, the nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs. And there are about 500,000 of these in English. And if you want to know more about the story of English, this is probably the pick of the book at the moment. You could also see Stephen Fry's Planet Words. Then there are the figurative language, the representational language with these terms here. What I want to point out to you is when you teach, we call these the parts of speech. And as teachers, we're going to have a great deal of trouble with some students if we call these figures of speech. So my recommendation is figurative language, and these are the terms for it. Moving on, we get the students to use dictionaries because we use the parts of speech to actually get access to the dictionary. I'll show you shortly. This is a very simple little technique, the adjective noun poem, which I picked up and developed from work by Bill Martin Jr. with his song. And, red socks, green socks, yellow socks, blue socks, that kind of thing. And I get the children to tell me what their favourite animal is, and I show them and we model how it's done. So there is a scaffold here, 2 words per line with the same word down here. And with very young children, we get this kind of activity going. Now, you'll see this example in the book, and you'll see my story as to how I worked with Josh to get that. But you can use the dictionary for alliterative adjective poems. So you have to find 5 new adjectives to describe your particular animal and finish up with that kind of activity. And when you present, when the student presents, I stand behind the student and do a bit of mumble reading because they can't read or remember some of those long words. And then they have to tell us which word they like, which nice new word they like. But when you go through the dictionary, one of the things to do is to open something like the Oxford, but instead of looking at the words down here, trawl through the dictionary looking for the part of speech, which is sitting usually somewhere through here. And I train the students to look for interesting verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Very few adverbs, of course. You never use the dictionary to find interesting nouns. That's done in the thesaurus. So the basic principle for teaching concepts of language is scaffold the activities, model, and teach. Let's see how it's done. Again, in this particular strategy, the ANVA, adjective, noun, verb, adverb, the students are given an animal, begins with 1 letter, and they have to provide the adjective and the verb and the adverb to start with the same letter. So you have an alliteration again around the parts of speech. The students can produce their own page, illustrate it, and come up with a classroom animalia book. And the scores of teachers who have given me feedback about that have said the students have loved it. They've also been able to go back into dictionaries to change the verb or the adjective to make sense, to make it easier to illustrate. Then you can move on to that notion of the four words, the noun, the adjective and the noun and the verb. You can change and start using other structures back here, such as the prepositional phrase. But there you have a complete sentence. And in this particular activity, and it's step by step, we get the students to add an adjectival phrase, an adjectival clause, and a simile. So you get this kind of arrangement. And the lovely part about it at the end is that I can say to one student, bring out your noun, your complex, your little noun group, point to another one to bring out the adjectival phrase or with phrase, another one to bring out the adjectival clause. And by the way, then you will find out how to make the distinction between clause and phrase and how to teach it, plus a simile, and you get this rather interesting thing which comes straight out of the Dr. Seuss. The students love it and they all want to come out front and do their activity. It's a great lesson, makes you feel confident that the kids have learned. And finally, teaching prepositions as well as other parts of speech. But here's the prepositions. I asked the students to tell me where is the pen in relation to the book. I used to use this tactic and I would get Latinate expressions like parallel to. But when I put it here, they tell me it's beneath, under, below. I get them to show me where the pen is in certain positions, list the words, we read them, and then with advice from Lee Carter, with whom I worked at Bribie Island about 5 years ago, we decided to show the poem first, what it looked like in another child's handwriting, and the kids were hooked. From that, we worked out the rules. They're all in the book, and the children wrote lots of poems like that. And we were in a position then to say to the students, what I'd like you to do next time is to put an adjective in front of the noun in the prepositional phrase. That's a lot of meta language, and the students from year 3 upwards, virtually every student knows exactly what we're talking about because they've been involved in the development of the process themselves. There is a lesson there on teaching how to go about teaching clauses, and even a way and step by step where you can get your students in year 4, 5 or older to write 4 clause sentences. So there you have a dependent clause with an embedded adjectival clause with another dependent clause at the end. There are 4 clauses. You can get students in year 4 and 5 doing that. You have to tell them to do it and remind them to do it. But that's the kind of requirement in NAPLAN at year 9. We're not teaching to NAPLAN, but we're teaching everything that NAPLAN could possibly measure. There's some information on how to teach pronouns, complete with the board, and how the board should look for it. There's a lot of work on teaching vocabulary. Gail Tompkins' chapter was brilliant. And what we've done, particularly with Marie Cosgrove at Aspley East State School last year, was work with her class to develop a new strategy for teaching words. But in that chapter, you will see resources and lists of words for you to use. Plus, here is the section, the framework for teaching words, Tier 1 words, Tier 2 words, Tier 3. But in this little section here on nurturing students who are English as an additional language or dialect, it tells you how to go about doing that. There's a system for teaching nuances and connotation in words. The chapter on differentiating instruction that I did with from Gail Tompkins, but with Gaynor Williams feeding information in, absolutely brilliant. Gaynor's work with Blueback was inspirational for me, and with the ideas. So you'll find in here ways to address struggling readers' problems, the component, the problem, and the solutions. 2.5 pages. That's a handbook in itself. And finally, we get to the compendium of instructional procedures, probably the top thing in all of the work that Gail Tompkins has left behind us, left for us. And at that stage, I'd just like to point out that we think, and certainly we like to think that Einstein, we're doing what Einstein said what teachers can do, awaken joy and creative expression and knowledge. Carol.
Well, thanks, Rod. I'll just have to spend a little bit of time now talking about MyEducationLab, which, as I previously mentioned, I worked on in that first edition of the text. The MyEducationLab provides resources for teachers, for students, for university lecturers like myself that are supportive of learning, and I guess that's what we're all looking for. The video library, which is easily accessed, provides visual learners with examples of real-life classroom pedagogy, and as I mentioned earlier, a lot of that is very localised. Promotes understanding, opportunities for conversation in classrooms, in PD sessions, in lectures and tutorials, and reflection on practice. And I mean, that's something that we're all looking for. I've used these resources with primary and secondary education students, and given our students' trepidation now about teaching a diverse range of learners in all sorts of classrooms, I've really found the lab to be an invaluable resource. Just recently, when viewing a clip with Lisa, who was teaching a Year 1 class on how to write, one of my students commented, "This puts the theory into practice, now I understand." So again, there are features to this MyEducationLab. One is that there's a range of topics that are covered, from assessment through to teaching phonics to teaching word knowledge. And I find that the teacher interviews at the end of each of the clips are really, really insightful and excellent resource for demonstrating the power of reflection in teaching at all levels. So once again, my students go back and use those clips for their own reflection, their own thinking. So that's something that we want all teachers to do. And so I guess, again, in terms of what makes the text different for me and what I use it for, this is something that's quite outstanding. I think it's your turn, Scott.
Okay, thank you for that. That was good. And we've actually got a couple of questions that have that have come through during the presentation. So I'll just pose them to both Rod and Carol, and feel free to reply as you like. So this one's come through from Matthew. He says, "I am an AP from Sydney, and I'm wondering what a session would look like for Year 3 to 6 students, and what technology you would recommend to enhance learning."
Carol, do you want to go first?
Well, I think in any classroom you need to have that understanding of what a literacy block looks like. So you would have your sessions, which include the shared, the guided, the independent reading and writing and oral language. In terms of technology, there is so much that is out there, and again, it's all highlighted in the text. I'm happy to send through some of those links after this, if you'd like, Matthew. But there's no, to me, technology is the resource, it doesn't do the teaching. So as long as you keep the framework in mind and that explicit teaching of what it is that you're trying to get through to your students in terms of whether you're teaching for language literacy or literature, you can't go wrong. And you use whatever it might be as that resource to extend the learning. Rod, do you want to...
One of the things I've found in feedback from teachers is that work on developing very complex noun groups, very detailed noun groups, can be done using an interactive whiteboard, flying the bits and pieces in and moving them around. But what we find is the students get more about it by using the strips of paper with different colour and writing and manipulating them themselves using their fingers. It's more effect. It brings another development, and it's not just visual and spoken language with it. It's also that kinesthetic effect that's being used to add to the learning. And what we found with these strategies, many learning support teachers tell them they work beautifully with their students as well. Problem, of course, getting them to apply it. But that's another issue. Thanks very much.
Okay, yep. We've got another couple of questions here which I'll go through, and I apologise for the background noise, but I'll mute myself as quickly as I can after posing the question. Another question here from Amanda. Would the text support a primary school who has implemented the CAFE reading approach and is implementing the writer's workshop/notebook.
Mm-hmm. Yep, whatever strategies, whatever system we have here can be used in any program that you're offering, any particular program. The book itself gives you strategies for teaching the content knowledge. And the CAFB, oh, right. Yes, I know the one. Yeah, definitely. You could use any of the vocab work, particularly that vocab component that goes with the reading program, reading comprehension program. Yeah.
And one of the things, I think, if I can come in there, Rod, is that with the writing, chapters on writing and building, so we've got the teaching of reading and writing processes, and then working with youngest readers and writers and so on. There's a developmental nature which, you know, through the text, which is very much supportive of what's in the Australian curriculum, which enables you to use the text in conjunction with whatever one of those programs you are looking at. The other thing I think the other point that needs to be made is that notion of reciprocal gain. You know, the text and that's one of the things that was a key point for me. It wasn't just to focus on reading and writing was the poor cousin. It really, really is honing in on let's develop this balanced understanding to the teaching and language acquisition of our kids, teaching of skill and language acquisition of our students. So, yeah, I think, Amanda, that you would find it, there would be nothing different from using this text. In fact, I think you'd see some of the video clips might be very useful.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Amanda.
Okay, and I'll brave coming back on the line just to ask. Well, we've got another couple of questions here, which I think we can get through. This one's from Phil, and I'll try and get some of these words correct. At which age would you teach students to use the terms and parts of speech, such as alliteration, onomatopoeia, hyperbole, assonance, etc.?
I'll do it. I use the terms adjective, definitely year one, at the latest, the second half of year one. Because they can talk about describing words and use them to write their own adjective noun poem, I tell them that they know how to use it, they no longer need to call it a describing word, and that it has a proper name called an adjective. And the adjective is the simplest part of speech to teach, and it is the most useful part of speech to teach first. I don't know why traditionally we teach the noun and verbs so early on, primarily because we need to keep referring to it. The noun verb is the kernel sentence, and we need to talk about it there. I would talk about noun and verb with the preschoolers by using an activity where I get the thesaurus to give me all the words for walk, and I make a selection of the words for walk, and then I get my preschoolers, my kindergartners, and I've done this in Singapore as well as in a few schools in Australia. I get them to match animals with the walks. They have lions prowl, snakes slither, and the kids work around on the floor. You know, they actually act out these things, and we write up the stories about the animals, which are things and therefore nouns, and the actions, the activities that go with it are the verbs, the doing things. That, of course, leaves the problem open for being verbs. There's this element where even in upper primary, I'm coming across classrooms where children are not understanding that verbs are also being verbs. To shorten all of that, nouns and verbs are very complex parts of speech. The other parts of speech which function almost perfectly, like adjectives, prepositions, the preposition I do in year 3, alliteration, year 1, because the kids understand it, onomatopoeia, 2 ways, any grade level, the most common word, pop, and then you can give them that lovely little word in English, the most onomatopoeic word in English, susurrus, which means the soft rustling sound through a grassy field or a wheat field. Then the sound echoes the sense. You can teach these concepts at any grade level, but they need to be seen in context with stories and real authentic texts around them. Teaching any concept, any term outside of the context of a story and following it up is not going to work. And that's why grammar has such a bad name over 200 or 300 years. But basically it doesn't have to have such a bad name if it can be seen to be used. And that's where I've taken all this work. It's almost a life's work.
Rod, can I just add, with the video clip, Bill, if you're listening still, Lisa actually teaches. Do you remember, Rod, the writing section?
Yeah.
And she has children. She demonstrates to them how to write a narrative. And she uses alliteration, she uses onomatopoeia, and it's just amazing what the children are doing in year 1. Now, my students are pretty blown away by that. So I guess my other consideration always is it depends on the students. So yes, some year 1s handle it and there's no difficulty, but it very much depends upon your individual learners.
Yeah.
Is that okay, Rod?
Yeah, it's fine. There's a page. There's a page in Year 6 that answers all your questions. It tells you exactly what parts of speech, what syntactic patterns to teach in what grades, at which grade level. And in the companion book, it's all set out for you. Thanks very much for your question there, Bill or Phil. I didn't catch your name properly.
So that was Phil. I'm back on the line now. And we've got one last question, which I will include. So the question is from Jenny. And it says, does this pedagogy apply to programs for Indigenous students who may be using accelerated literacy?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Scott, I didn't hear that question.
Yeah, I heard the question. Can you use these teaching strategies and the programs you can develop from them, or the programs you would put in there, with Indigenous students using accelerated learning? You don't use accelerated learning every day in every activity. Particularly if you're using the direct instruction method that goes with it. But yes, you can use it with Indigenous students. The preposition phrase poem I've used to teach, that is now being used by teachers in kindergarten in China, teaching the English prepositional phrase structure. Works beautifully. There is a way of doing it, and I'm quite willing to send you that information. But all of those strategies work with students for whom English is an additional language, or for whom it's an additional dialect. I've used them throughout from a couple of places in Indonesia, schools in Singapore, China and India, as well as in many schools in Australia at all levels. Yes. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, Jenny.
Okay, now thank you everybody for your questions. We're going to have to leave it there because we're slightly over time. Hopefully the line is clearer now that I'm back on. But just to wrap up, you'll be receiving an email from us about mid-next week with a link through to the recording of today's webinar, and we'll attempt to create a transcript of some of the questions that came up as well. So this is the end of the webinar, and I'd like to thank everyone for attending. If you had any follow-up questions after today's session that you didn't get a chance to ask, feel free to email them through to me at scott.charles@pearson.com. But otherwise, as I say, we'll make all of this content available to you by mid-next week. And thank you, everybody, for your time.
Thanks,
Thank you
Scott.
very much for attending. And thank you, Scott. Thanks, Carol.